All right, it's time to do it again. So, what are we going to talk about today? This is probably going to be a shorter one than normal, so hopefully you can tolerate this. But I'm going to talk about Fett baggies. There's been a couple of threads lately about Fett baggies, and so I thought this would be an appropriate time to talk a little bit about them. And again, the point here is more on education with the ability to show you a little bit about what I have in my collection. Now, the topic of baggies is always very tough, simply because over the last 10 years now, there's been a slew of fake baggies, and I'm actually going to show you some of them just to give you an idea about what you can look for to distinguish. Now, the one thing I wish I could talk about, I don't have them in front of me, I have them somewhere and I couldn't find them, but anyways, are the measurements. I think one thing that is very helpful is knowing the measurements of the baggie types, because that usually is a dead giveaway in terms of really being able to tell the difference between the baggies. The other aspect of it, of course, is the feel of the plastic. 40 plus or 40-year-old plastic or 35-year-old plastic or whatever has a much different feel than, let's say, 5-year-old plastic. And so there's many other ways that you can tell. Again, there's even been the tape lifting of the text. But while that makes in some of the baggies you can tell that they're fake, but you can also lift up some of the text with tape, even that are not supposedly fake. So that's kind of can be a little dangerous. I've certainly done it a number of times and ripped the text right off and thought, oh man, this is it. So, but I would never necessarily advocate the novice doing that. I'd always suggest that someone that knows a lot about baggies do that themselves. And so anyway, so we're going to go through a small collection of Fett baggies, go over some of the differences, and we'll go from there. So I had shown this one before, but this is probably one of the first baggies of Fett, and this is the SW/B. You can see here, this has got basically vertical text, and you can see that the letters, the font, I think sans serif, something like that. Anyways, this is one of the early ones. We've already talked about a debate about the light green chested one never coming in a baggie like this, and the light green chested were thought some of the earlier Fett releases. So again, that's a debate I'm not going to get into. But anyways, when you look at the archives layout of the U.S. baggie releases, this is the first one in line, which is the SWB baggie. Okay, now that is of course a graded one. We'll give you a loose one, which is here. Okay, so the text is a little bit more worn off, but you can see sort of a general size of the baggie as well as the font type. Now the second one in that list, of course, is the D baggie, SWD, and I'm going to give you a similar one. So this is the most common Fett baggie out there. It has the horizontal text made in Hong Kong. This is, and we'll come back to this one, this actually is not a standard SWD, but again, we'll talk about that later. But this is the general, let's say look, feel, size of the SWD baggie. Well, the next one on that list, of course, those were the, let's say, Star Wars era baggies. Now, of course, there was one that came out later, and this probably fell right in between the Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back, but this has brought up a tremendous amount of controversy. I don't know, you can barely see the text on this one, but again, it's a vertical text, so this was originally called SWB, but the font is very different. It's much more blocky, much smaller in height, and so there was, the question of whether it was an ROTJ /J baggie, but of course that didn't make any sense based on the timeline, and so that brought up a couple of wild and interesting threads about it. But anyways, when you see a vertical text baggie that is not that sans serif or doesn't look like the original B baggie, there's a chance that it could be one of these other variants. You can see these in a lot of, like I said, Boba Fett's had these baggies, and even some of the mailers had them, and they have been confirmed on by different baggie experts, as well as the official, I almost could say the official, but the UK has a great baggie guide by Mr. Muse. How you doing, Frank? Anyways, now we get into basically the Empire Strikes Back baggies. Now, the first baggie that came out was the ESBA, and you can see it here. Basically, it was a Kenner logo with thin border around the Kenner logo, and then a Made in Hong Kong just below it or above it if it's upside down, obviously. But anyway, so that's the first one. There was a version, basically a second version of this one, where the borders around Kenner were a little bit thicker. Again, you can read a little bit more about that through Frank's baggie guide, but that was the ESBA. Now, the ESBB is this little number here, and so it had basically a colored or a two-tone Kenner logo, and then a Made in Hong Kong in black. That was once again right below it. This, is thought to only have come in the baggied version of the Vader case, the Bounty Hunter edition that came with Fett, IG-88, and Bosk. The IG-88 version of this baggie goes for, usually at least a couple thousand. It's a very, very, very rare baggie, and not all of the Vader cases with the Bounty Hunters came with an ESBB. Some of them did come with an ESBA, as someone that I know just found out recently. So it's just something to keep in mind. But this is this is what the baggie looks like. This is another version of it, but as I'll talk about a little bit later, this one is fake. But looks pretty good. Size is off. The feel of the plastic is kind of cheap and thin. But again, we'll go over that a little bit later. So the next ESB baggie is the ESBH. And so this, if this wasn't made for, something like the Rancor Keeper or the Gamorrean Guard, certainly the more thin ones like Fett had a lot of room to move around in. So this is just an interesting baggie, but there's no marks on it. It's heat sealed. You can see the size of it, but it's ESBH. And then the last U.S. baggie, or at least the one that's more commonly known, let's see, here it is. Basically, it's the ROTJ-A, okay? So plastic is kind of a stiffer plastic. It says made in Taiwan in blue. No Kenner around it, standard blaster, standard Fett. This was obviously a later release. This came in a lot of, let's say, ROTG multi-packs. I don't think this one ever came in a mailer. Mailers weren't going out at that time. But you can hear that plastic. So anyways, that's one of the things you start to really think about when you get a baggie is how does it feel? If it feels kind of cheap, it's probably fake. That's a really loose and ridiculous way of looking at it, but a lot of times that's where your suspicions get high, and then you consult the baggie experts and kind of tell you a little bit more about it. All right. So those are kind of the standard U.S. releases. Now, there are a number of other baggie types. I think, one of the more well-known, of course, are paletoy baggies. Now, I think those are very much more difficult to distinguish because, one, you don't have as much familiarity with them. Two, because unfortunately they are from a place where there were a lot more baggies that were supposedly faked, and so at least that's my opinion. But one of the most common is what's called the paletoy B baggie, and that is made in Hong Kong. It's kind of in almost a teal or a blue-green or whatever you want to call it, upside down, when the figure was bagged. Again, this feels like 35, 40-year-old plastic. You can see it. You can see the size. Again, I wish I had the measurements, but I don't. I'll have to look those up and add an addendum or something like that. But anyways, a Palitoy B. Now, one of the other ones that had come up over the last several years is I'll come back to this baggie that looks like a SWD, but the font is a little bit darker and thicker. And so they came out, I think it was a Palitoy O baggie. It was kind of like, the UK's version of the SWD. Now, of course, these require you put them basically side by side with the SWD, and you can actually see the font differences. And again, this plastic feels not like quality plastic. It's not cheap. It's not thin. Again, the measurements are good on this one. So this is one you don't see very often, but it's there. All right, I think, and then to me, this is the most famous of the non-US baggies, and that, let me pull it out here. And that is the Meccano sort of free sample baggie with the red label. It's stapled closed. You can see this is a tri-Boba Fett. And so this one, I'd been looking for this for a very, very long time, and was very, very, very fortunate, lucky, whatever you want to call it, to have this come into my collection very recently. I was very happy about this one. All right, so that's just kind of a general rundown on the most. There's still a couple that I don't have, believe it or not. There's a Palitoy A, which has a horizontal made in Hong Kong, but it's a little bit of a different color. And then there's also a Palitoy H, apparently. But anyways, someday. So just a couple of things on fake baggies again. I'll show you one that's pretty clear. So this is supposedly an ESBA. I don't know if you can, it's hard to, you just got to touch it. But anyways, this is real cheap. You can see that the baggie is very, very short for the figure. It doesn't fit any of the standard measurements. Anyways, and so it was very clear when I got my hands on this that it was fake, but I was glad I did, because this is a very good example of a faked baggie. So there's that one. Like I said, the other ESBV one that I have, same kind of thing, very, very short baggie. I'm pretty sure this is fake, but I don't know, just because the plastic is very different than you normally feel for these, and so I'm guessing that it just must be. But it's very interesting nonetheless. I had never seen a faked ESBB. I assume it is. I mean, maybe it's not. I'm sure I could send it off for authentication, but anyways, I like to keep it around just as an example. I'm never going to sell it, so I'm not, trying to pull the wool over. And then we have this one, which is, supposed to be a SWD baggie. This thing is, way too big. It's very rare that the horizontal text is so close to the seal. I mean, it's possible. I'm sure there are some out there that are legitimate. I certainly don't think this one is. I mean, you can see how much larger the bag is than the figure. It's definitely larger than all of the legit ones that I have. And again, that plastic is very thin, kind of very cheap. So, I mean, I'm convinced this is fake, unless someone tells me otherwise, which I don't think that's going to happen. So, anyways, well, that's all I'm going to say about that. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope you learned something. If there's any questions, you can always ask, but I would always point the finger to the main baggie guys. You know who you are. They are always very, very willing to help. Look at pictures, guide you in any way they can. So lean on those people, whether it's Andrew, Frank, Mike, Andy, there's Shane, there's a lot. So anyways, have a good day. Again, as always, stay safe, and hopefully we'll get through this pretty soon. All right, see you later.